Hello, welcome to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. This is my first of what I hope is many short Bible videos I'll be able to share with you. I'm making these videos for people who believe in God and for people who believe that the Bible is God's inspired word. The most important thing you can know about the Bible is that from Genesis to Revelation, it's one message. And when you understand the Bible, you'll see the unity and harmony of that message. Also, it's important to know that you can divide all of human history into three time periods. From creation to Mount Sinai, be known as the patriarchal age. From Sinai to the cross, can be known as the Mosaic age. And from the cross to the end of time, can be known as the Christian age. And the differences of these time periods is how God communicated his will to the people. During the patriarchal time, God communicated his will verbally to the patriarch, to the heads of the family. He told Noah to build the ark and Abraham to go to the promised land, and so on. During the Mosaic period, from Mount Sinai to the cross, God communicated his will to the law of Moses and then the prophets. And of course, from the cross to the end of time, God communicates his will to the gospel of Christ. But it's important to understand that even during the patriarchal period and the Mosaic period, it was always God's intention from the very beginning to establish one universal religion for all nationalities and people for all the rest of time from the time of Christ. In this first video, I'm going to share with you a teaching tool that was first introduced to me back in the 1970s, and it's the Old Testament timeline. And I've been using the Old Testament timeline in sermons, Bible studies, and personal studies for more than 40 years. Over the years, it's taken many forms, and this is one of my latest versions of the timeline. And you'll see here that I have a tree representing the Garden of Eden. Of course, I have the Ark, I have Abraham, I have the birth of Moses, Sinai, wilderness, J&J for Joshua and Judges, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, captivity, and the last thing in the Old Testament will be Malachi, the last writer around 430 BC. And then once the time of Malachi, after the time of Malachi, there was a period of 400 years silence where there was no inspired message from God. That was until that silence was broken with the coming of John the Baptist. But here is we begin our timeline. The first 11 chapters of Genesis give us the history of the world. That's where we learn about the Garden of Eden, the pre-flood world, and of course then the flood in the days of Noah, and of course the Tower of Babel that tells us about the descendants of Noah. So these first 11 chapters of Genesis, like I said, to give us the history of the world, are kind of controversial because you have many of the very intelligent people of the world. Of course, they believe the earth is millions and millions of years old, where you have Christian people like myself who believe that the earth is only thousands of years old. And in future videos, we'll be looking a little closer at the pre-flood world in some of these early days. But for now, just know that those events are covered in Genesis 1 through 11. But then in chapter 12 of Genesis, the Bible takes a significant change when God calls Abraham to be the father of the Jewish nation. Now, when God called Abraham, his name was Abram, that meant mighty father. But later God changed his name to Abraham, that meant father of many nations. And in Genesis 12, when God called Abraham, he made him three promises. He said, I'm going to bless you and make your name great, which he did. He said, I'll make you into a great nation. He did, the nation of Israel. And then he said, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. What that meant was that one day, through Abraham's descendants, Christ would come. And we know this is true because when we read the New Testament book of Galatians chapter 3, it says that God preached the gospel to Abraham. That is the good news. When God told Abraham that through his descendants all nations of the earth would be blessed. Now the book of Genesis goes on to tell us how Abraham had a son of promise, Isaac. Isaac in turn had a son, Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. Jacob became the father of 12 sons, and their descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel. We know that one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, was sold by his brothers as a slave to Egypt, but there through God's providence, he was raised up to be ruler over all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. And that in turn led to the family of Jacob moving to Egypt, where they grew into a great nation. And so by the time of the birth of Moses, Israel was a great nation in bondage in the land of Egypt. And of course, God used Moses to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received his law. But because of their unbelief, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then after the death of Moses, we have Joshua, who became leader of the nation of Israel, and he led them into the promised land and divided the land among their descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel. And for the first few hundred years, the children of Israel were ruled by judges. So the J and J are for Joshua and Judges. And after a few hundred years, the children of Israel wanted a king to rule them like all the other nations. And so they came to Samuel, the last judge, and God told Samuel to anoint Saul to be the first king. And so this brings us to the next period of Old Testament history, which is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is going to stand for 120 years. It's going to have three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Each are going to reign for a period of 40 years. That gives us the 120 years of the United Kingdom. Then on the death of Solomon, the kingdom is going to divide and have 10 tribes going to rebel and establish the northern kingdom of Israel. And then you're going to have Judah and Benjamin in the south forming the kingdom of Judah. Now this period of the divided kingdom is going to serve as the background for the prophets. And this is going to be, of course, also a time of the kings. Now, each of these kingdoms are going to have 19 different kings. The difference is that the northern kingdom is going to be composed of 19 different dynasties, or 19 different families are going to reign. Also, this is going to be a kingdom that was founded on idolatry. So this division is going to take place around 930 BC. So this northern kingdom is going to last for 200 years. They're going to have a 200-year history, where then finally in 721 they're going to be taken into captivity by the Assyrian Empire and scattered out among the nations. And then the Assyrians are going to take other people they had conquered and plant them in the land of Palestine. And that's where we find the Samaritan people in the New Testament. So when you read the New Testament about the Samaritan people, you're going to see that they had been in the land of Israel since 700 BC, since this time of captivity. Now the southern kingdom of Judah, they're going to last a little longer. They're going to last about 100 years longer. And the main difference between the two kingdoms is, as I mentioned, there are going to be 9 different dynasties ruling in Israel. But in Judah, all the kings are going to be descendants of David that are on the throne. Some of these kings are going to be just as wicked as the kings of Israel, but you're going to have some good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah. But they, like the northern kingdom, eventually, because of their disobedience to God, are going to be taken into captivity, but not by Assyria, but by the Babylonians. There's a change that's occurring during this Old Testament period. When Israel was first established in the Canaan land, power was pretty diversified. You had God's people dwelling there, surrounded by neighboring nations. To the south, you had the Edomites. To the east, you had the Moabites and Ammonites. To the north, you had the Syrians and the Phoenicians. And to the southeast, you had the Philistines. But you see a change when you enter into the time of the divided kingdom. You see a kind of a consolidation of power. During this time, you had Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. But both of those kingdoms are going to be conquered by the Babylonians. That it's going to be the first of 4 great empires to rule the world leading up to the time of Christ. And we'll be looking at that in detail in a future video. But for now, just know that the Babylonians are going to come against Judah in three ways. They're going to come in 606, that's when Daniel and the wealthiest people will be taken into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar will come again in 587, this is when Ezekiel, the prophet, and another group of captives will be taken. And then Nebuchadnezzar will come one more time in 586 when the last king, Zedekiah, rebels against him. And at that time, he's going to destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And then in accordance to the promise that God made through Jeremiah the prophet, his people are going to spend 70 years in captivity until they're allowed to return under the Persian kings in 536. And then this will be leading up to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and the last three prophets, that is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, will be the last voices of the Old Testament before that 400 year of silence. Now, another way of looking at the Old Testament, besides the timeline, is looking at the books itself. And so when you look at the books of the Old Testament, there's 39 books. You have 5 books of law, 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, 5 major prophets, and 5 minor prophets. As we already mentioned, the book of Genesis tells about the foundation of the world in the first 11 chapters. But then in chapter 12, with the call of Abraham, the rest of the book of Genesis tells how Abraham's family grew and were established by God. Then in the book of Exodus, of course, we find that Abraham's family had grown into the nation of Israel. And Exodus tells how Moses led the people out of Egypt. And then in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we read about their wanderings in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. Once you get to the book of Joshua, which is the first book of history, you have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicle, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These actually cover the entire timeline of the Old Testament. And the other books, that is the books of poetry and the prophets, fit into different time periods of that Old Testament timeline. And we'll be, again, looking at some of that in greater detail when we look at some future videos. But I'm going to close now with giving you another simple way of understanding the Old Testament. I tell people that after we have the history of the world in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the whole focus of the Bible changes when God calls Abraham, not only to be the father of the Jewish nation, but also the one through whom Christ would come. So at 2000 BC, you have God promising Abraham that through his descendants one day Christ will come. Well, 1,000 years later, you have David, who himself was a descendant of Abraham, and God renews that promise to David, that he tells David that through his descendants Christ will come. But when you open up the New Testament, Matthew 1 verse 1, it says this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So an easy way to understand the Old Testament is, it's just the keeping of a promise to a friend. Everything that happened in the Old Testament was simply a way of God keeping his promise to bring Christ into the world through the family of Abraham. I hope this video has been interesting and has been an encouragement to you. And as I said, Lord willing, we'll have more videos to come. Have a good day.